Today on Rebuilders, we are talking about two big things, revival and the rightward turn. Tell us more.
Yeah, two things are happening, two trends in the world. One is there is a sort of renewal kicking off. We've been talking about it. There's a genuine seeming turnaround of the church in certain places, particularly with young people coming back to church, a renewed faith. It's different. Like doing church is different to 2019. So that is happening in the world. But at the same time, there seems to be this sort of cultural shift, political shift, social shift to the right. Right-wing political parties are growing. The Overton window seems to be moving further to the right. After a period where people thought that sort of the left was ascendant, there seems to be some sort of conservative, renewal, for want of a different word. And the question we're asking today is, what is the link between these two things? Do they interplay? Is there stuff we need to be aware of? Even do we need to be careful of? I think lots to unpack in today's episode.
Yeah, let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you guys?
There is a disturbance in the force. A vast majority of our audience listen on various podcasting platforms, but there is YouTube and
Spotify now as well.
Spotify also has video. But for those who are not watching, you'll be missing out on a change that has occurred to our podcast, and that is that you can now see Daniel. He exists, and we talked about this. The people have asked for it. Like they've had so many messages, can we see Daniel? So Daniel's finally rigged up a camera for himself. But a transformation has occurred, and the usually humble, servant-hearted Daniel has just
brimming with pride and ego.
He's it's like Tom Cruise after having a Red Bull.
Is it? Is that how you?
Yeah, he's filled with verve and vigor.
My demeanor at the moment.
He just keeps looking at the camera, pointing at it, admiring himself, and yeah, it's a whole new order here.
This could be like a one-hit wonder. Like I could edit it up, put it out, and then just
never do it again.
Never be seen again. Yeah. No, like, I mean, welcome to being seen.
Thank you. I have been on the other side.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've done okay, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't let it go too much to my head.
Here's the real question. How much are you going to cut between your face and our faces?
I think it's just on me the whole time now.
That's fair.
We'll fade into insignificance. Yeah. But check it out on YouTube.
Welcome.
Yeah, you can see Daniel.
Nice.
Yeah. Nice to have you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've always been here.
Yes.
You're getting the visual as well.
Yeah.
Great.
Very good. Well, let's get into it for today.
Let's get into it.
So today, Mark, you've sort of loosely titled, or maybe not so loosely titled, this episode, Revival and the Rightward Turn. Now, those seem like two quite distinct things. How are they linked? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so if you go back and listen to our past episodes where you couldn't see Daniel, gesticulating at us and, offensive gestures and eating and stuff like this, you'll notice that we have covered two trends. One being what seems to be the beginnings of some kind of renewal, awakening, revival, stuff happening in the UK with the Quiet Revival. I shared how I was in Northern Europe and, saw stuff happening in Scandinavia and other places. And we're seeing similar statistics in the United States. Just before we came on air, we were just listening to a Fox News report on just the stats of downloads of Bible apps and Bible purchases first time and worship music on Spotify. All of this stuff indicating that there's some kind, would you say it's like a full-blown Great Awakening yet? Probably not. Is it even a revival yet? But something's changing, like there is this energy. Lots of friends who in a lot of the spaces finding, particularly young people, there's been a lot of chat around Gen Z coming to church, coming back to church, coming to church for the first time. So, we've been charting that story, so where are we in the historical continuum of that? It feels like something's beginning.
Yeah.
other story that we've been charting, a lot of, I guess, when I think about podcasting I've done on other podcasts I've guested on this podcast, go back to this cultural moment I did with John Mark. A lot of that story was talking about the rise of sort of Western secularism, sort of move towards a sort of progressive secular tone in politics and culture. But then we sort of marked, over the last sort of year, 18 months, this rightward shift in the culture. Obviously, the second term of Donald Trump marked that, to many people's surprise. But also you're seeing this in, the swing to the right politically, particularly in Europe, seeing that in lots of places. And, the future that we're sort of looking at is one in which, you're probably going to see more rightward governments. So asking the question, what does that mean? How is that changing the world? So two big trend lines, revival or the beginnings of revival, a rightward turn in the world. But what I thought today would be really interesting in talking about, because I think this is a question I'm being asked a little bit off the record. Many people have a conversation about these things and say, hey, Mark, are you noticing an interplay between these two things? Is there two things linked? Is the natural outcome of a religious revival that people get more conservative? Or is, there's an element where there's sort of a conservative, grabbing of parts of whatever. I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about those two, the interplay between those two things.
Great. So let's maybe start with the more political side of this conversation, the rightward turn. Obviously, for many years on this podcast, we've talked about grey zone, the dynamics of grey zone, how we're in a weird space that can't really be defined. And also for the last couple of years, you've been looking on the horizon, sketching out, are we moving towards a new era? Is this potentially a new era, the rightward turn? Can you explore some of that for us?
Yeah. Well, I think firstly, let's look at some of the evidences of the rightward turn. So obviously, I mentioned it before, but let's go again. Donald Trump returning to power, clear sign of something happening, particularly after, seemingly his sort of brand of politics being rejected, with the Biden presidency, but then this return of many groups and groups who hadn't previously voted for him, voting for him. But also too, if you look at where Europe is politically, you're seeing a sort of surge. It's not just a turn to conservatism, it's for further reaches of conservatism, further to the right. So, the continued rise of the AfD in Germany, the precariousness of the French government. We just had a French prime minister removed and then brought back in. How long can Macron last? Probably not that much longer. It just seems inevitable now, that you're going to see, Marine Le Pen and the sort of further reaches of the right come to power in France. So possibly, the future political map of a lot of the West is not just going to be conservative parties coming in and the sort of centre-right parties like we've seen before of, what the Republicans used to look like under, say, Bush or, the Tories under, I don't know, John Major or something, or, the CDU in Germany. You're going to see, more and more sort of further right-wing parties come into power, have an influence on power. So that's number one. Second interesting thing is, that's politics, but also it's about culture, interlink between politics and culture. You've seen, interestingly, the change for Twitter to X with Elon Musk taking over the platform has had a cultural effect. One of the reasons that we talked about the rise of this significant sort of progressive political mood amongst younger people is also because that's the way the algorithms were trending. So what you've had Twitter as sort of, or X as an outlier. However, we saw with the inauguration of Donald Trump, the tech sort of giants really sort of falling into line. But it's going to be interesting with TikTok because TikTok, which is formerly controlled by, was it ByteDance, it's a Chinese state sort of, aligned entity. Now with the sort of battle over that, and I think it's safe to say that I was wrong. TikTok didn't get banned. Still some time in the game, but I'm willing to admit defeat. But I think the essence of what I was arguing there is still correct, that it couldn't continue, that you had a Chinese-aligned massive social media platform unable to continue in the US. So basically Trump put an ultimatum that either it's sort of shut down or it is bought out by America. And, the CEO of Oracle, it's Larry Ellison. I always get his right.
I think so.
Larry Ellison, who, is a right-wing figure, friend of Trump, ally, basically TikTok will now swing to the right, most likely, with their takeover. You've also seen things like CBS, Paramount. I think Allison's also sort of purchased that, or his company's purchased that, and putting, Barry Weiss, who was sort of cancelled from the New York Times, who's been, I think, the editor of the Free Press, which sort of pushed back on woke, sort of more in that sort of classical liberal space. But, you're seeing, a large American TV network and streaming network, which owns Channel 10 here in Australia, another large. So what you're seeing is media organs, social media platforms that previously would have trended leftward are slowly turning to the right.
Sure.
You're seeing this overflow into film. You're seeing, even in social trends, it's interesting. Some research came out that transgender identification amongst young people has dropped by 50% in the last 18 months. And, just seeing different cultural signifiers of what looked like the direction of the previous culture actually now heading towards a more rightward turn. So that's going on. So as you rightly pointed out, does that then, this is the question I've been asking myself, does that then confirm that the next phase coming out of grey zone, for those who are listening for the first time, is, descriptor I've given, the intermediate phase between two eras.
Yes. Eras
don't neatly end and begin. There's always an in-between mashup, weird liminal space between the two. And, it was always like going to head to a new kind of order at some stage. Are we entering it with this rightward turn? So that's the question I've been asking for some time. What I had began to wonder was, is that actually what's happening with this rightward turn? I think I was sort of hinting at that last time we spoke about this.
Yes.
However, I just wanted to share, I'm starting to wonder that that's actually not what is happening. That the reality of establishing a political order in the current state that the world is in is extremely difficult. Now, I think that, one of the things that we tend to do is look backwards and try and sort of find analogies and comparisons in the past. But the unique situations that we face, not just individual countries, but as a world, have never really existed in this form before.
Yeah.
We've never had this level of interconnectivity across the globe, just in movement of people. The fact that you can hop on a plane and fly from Christchurch to, sort of London effectively in a day, never happened before. So you have an interconnected world. You also have a digitally connected world. So to just give you an example, I can't remember if I talked about this before, but, in Australia, we had some, anti-Semitic attacks. There was a synagogue burnt. Different things happened. Long story short, our intelligence services have basically found out that these were directed by the Iranians, but using a whole bunch of cutouts, basically paying the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, paying, crime gangs who are then paying intermediaries, who are then paying basically people who are sort of almost on the street to go and light. So I think the synagogue in East Melbourne, which was lit, the guy didn't even know it was a synagogue. If there was a house, he's paid by someone. Someone paid him, all through the dark web. But it just shows you how events happening in your society, government's control over society is far less than it was.
Yes.
So you live in this world where, what happens in a Chinese factory and what the Chinese decide to do with their factory and subsidizing their factory all of a sudden affects something happening in America.
Yes.
Australia and the United States yesterday just signed a massive minerals deal. So there's all these rare earth minerals that we need for our technology to continue. And China's basically put controls on them. China Controls has been building up control over the rare earths supply and refining. And I think they own something like 90% of rare earths. Australia has a lot of rare earths. So the US has just signed a deal with us to sort of use our rare earths, which will be sort of a financial boon to Australia. But it shows you that America's not in control of its destiny, that actually, if you want to have an interconnected economy where you have a phone which is made up of parts from all over the world, all these really interesting, different components that come together for this sort of, miracle of science and technology, America can't just go, well, we're going to make these locally because it's an interconnected global supply chain. Now, also too is, again, just to use an example from our city, we had a senior police official on the weekend basically go on TV and really share his frustration of the fact that our city's been disrupted by protests since October the 7th, around the issue of Palestine. And an issue like Palestine, which has happened on the other side of the world, it's been interesting traveling, just seeing how that is just affecting everywhere. We predicted this when we did our October the 7th episode 2 years ago, that it would have a global impact. And it really has. So an issue happening in another country has a huge impact where you are. As we get more diverse societies, multiculturalism, this is even more so. And then lastly, we could go on and on and on, things like about the environment, climate change and so on. But just to add this too, that economically, it's really hard for countries to have control even over their economies in ways that they used to. One of the big complaints of conservatives is that the government should stay out of regulating the markets. But really the power differential has now flipped. In many ways, markets really have control over governments now. The global economy is so big. So, for example, Donald Trump's plans, whatever he wants to do, is going to be hugely constrained by the giant sort of snowball on the horizon that's only gaining size as it comes down the hill, which is America's deficit and massive debt.
Sure.
That is not going away. That is not under the control of Donald Trump. If he defaults on it, American credit rating is gone. You could have a sort of run on the bond markets like we saw with, say, Liz Truss in the UK, where the markets in the City of London didn't like her financial plan. And so basically she was removed. So in other words, the markets have, in a sense, this inordinate power that they haven't had throughout history. So just say you're the Prime Minister of Australia, you're the President of the United States, you're the Chancellor of Germany. Your power over things is much more limited than it was. So what that means is there's been a tremendous draining of power from the West. Now, also, you're in a world where there's increasingly competition. So China is a rising power. It's got its own challenges. But, it's not like just America after World War II, say 1962, where it's in command of the industrial economy of the world. Power is draining away from the West, from the European Union, from other places. And India is also rising. India, who was aligned with America as part of the Quad, is now drifting seemingly more into China's orbit. All of these things have an effect. So I would hate to be a leader at the moment, because you're draining power, your countries are draining power, but at the same time, the expectations of your populace is growing. Because the norm was set during the 90s and the early 2000s or 2010s, maybe up to, up to the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, where people expect a lot of freedom to do what the heck they want to do. They've been encouraged with radical individualism to do what the heck they want to do. They want to see their rights and their individual identities affirmed, and protected. They grew in a consumer economy, which every year gave you more and more stuff, more and more ability to do stuff, travel, buy stuff, experiences. And so that becomes the default, and during that period, as we've spoken before, leaders were sort of managers because it was sort of purring along. There was deep structural problems under the surface, which have now come to light. So you've got people who that's defined, like low interest rates, I should be able to get a house, but also travel and do this and do that and buy the latest thing and all that. That world's gone, right? So you've got this tremendous force in the world, which is starting to trend conservative, that can be misread as truly conservative, that is actually a conservatism that wants to go back to the golden age of the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily want to be some amazing conservative who wants, or some sort of doctrinaire ideological conservative. People are going to vote for parties who can promise to bring normality and some kind of flourishing and economic flourishing and sort of lifestyle and public spaces which reflect that lifestyle. So in other words, people want their lifestyles to go back to what either they experienced in the 90s and the 2000s or what they've seen online if they didn't live through that.
Yes.
So I would say this, the chaos, so interpreting the rightward turn, this is an extremely long answer, but this is why people listen.
Yeah.
Is I think the huge danger for conservatives and the new conservatism, which is in power, is thinking that people are 100% on board with what they're selling. What people really want is a sense of governments getting control back of the seemingly unraveling dream of what was portrayed in the 90s and the 2000s. And you just see that. You just see young Gen Z are so nostalgic about the 90s and the 2000s. Now, the funny thing is, having lived through it, it wasn't that. Literally in the 90s, everyone's thinking the world's going to, there's this incredibly apocalyptic. I just watched a documentary on the Aum Shinrikyo cult in Tokyo who put sarin gas in the Tokyo underground. And watching that go through the 90s and that group become increasingly paranoid. The 90s was a crazy time of sort of apocalyptic stuff, but it's a romantic looking back. That's what conservatism does. It's a romantic looking back. So people and populations are giving power to some of these new right groups, not because they're die-hard conservatives or new conservatives or MAGA conservatives or reform conservatives or AFD conservatives. It's because they want the governments to get control back so they feel like they can have those lives again of what it was like. Now, it's really interesting. Dominic Cummings, who was sort of the mastermind of the Leave campaign and was, sort of chief of staff for for Boris Johnson during his prime ministership, the slogan he came up with the Leave campaign was "Take back control."
Yeah.
And there's a movie on Brexit, which is worth watching with Benedict Cumberbatch, where he plays Dominic Cummings, and you see Cummings go through this, like how he gets to that slogan. And he comes to a realization that there's all these fissures of discontent in Britain.
Yeah.
Everything from people, like complaining about roads to a sense of, he's like, if we can pull all this discontent around a singular problem that you've lost control, and then we attach that to the question of whether Britain leaves the European Union, then we can win. And in many ways, that statement is still what people want. Now, I would argue that since Brexit's happened, and this is not a pro or anti-Brexit thing, is I don't think people would feel like control has gotten back. You know what I mean? You wouldn't see protests in Britain and the rise of reform if the Brexit vote had given them back control. So there is this elusive El Dorado on the horizon that many people in Western countries feel of, I just want back what we had or what I thought we had. I want to live my life, economically prosper, be free to be my individual self and buy stuff and live my best life. That's what they want. And they feel that is draining away. And that's happening at the same time that governments are losing power. So I'll wrap this up. Epic answer. I think we're seeing less a rightward turn as a desperate population sensing that a complex and complexifying world where they're increasingly not in control and governments are not in control is starting to get away from them. And they will vote for whoever promises to give that control back. And one way to understand the election of Donald Trump Donald Trump ran earlier, never got elected, because when things were humming along in that golden period, and as I'm saying, I don't think it's golden, but what was the imagined golden period, the managers just could keep it purring. Now they say we need someone with force, and we might not even like them, but we want someone with some sort of force and a rule breaker, because what we've been trying to do to get that back has not happened.
Yeah.
So that a potential AfD voter in Germany may not even like the AfD, ADF, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. or there might be people who have problems with Nigel Farage, but they're going to vote Reform because they're like, this isn't coming back. Can someone give us back control?
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is an increased grab for power. So people are willing to hand over more power to these governments to give them back control. But that's a little bit of a Faustian bargain with governments. So long story short, I don't think it's necessarily right. There is elements of a rightward turn, 100%. People are exhausted of chaos and complexity. The sort of centre-left, the sort of progressive thing hasn't delivered what they want. It seems to deliver a lot of people chaos. They want control, but I don't think they're all in as much as a lot of people on the further reaches of the right think that they are. And so what we're seeing is this interesting moment. So I think that this just spells ongoing disruption and an ongoing grey zone dynamic, because I don't think these people can pull us back to where we were, because I think the past is a distant country.
Okay, so that's a helpful way to understand the background of this move towards, or the rightward turn, as you put it. How is that context playing off or playing into or connected to revival?
Yeah. So long-term listeners and readers and engagers with my thoughts around this will know that, one of my classic sayings is crisis precedes renewal. And part of what I was getting at with that is that secular culture will hit a crisis, and the lack of meaning given by the secular story, the end point of endless consumerism, or what we begin to see, like we began to predict that secularism is going to start to struggle to continue to deliver this stuff. And, just a few things need to change. The economy needs to change. You get a war here. And, this is stuff I was saying in 2019, or a global pandemic. Yeah. And everything changes. So has that happened? Yes, we've seen that. So inevitably, is it everyone? No, but there is, a subset of people who have looked at the secular story going, this has fallen over, it's breaking its social contract, it can't deliver us what we want. So they're looking to religion. They're looking to other things as well, occultism and politics, and people are looking for meaning beyond just the super individualistic tone of sort of, late 2010s secularism. So we've seen that. So that's partially what is happening with these revivals alongside a sovereign move of God. So I think what's really interesting is, though, that now with this religious renewal happening, it's happening in the context of this rightward turn. It's happening, particularly for the English-speaking world, the most of the reflections you're going to get about this are happening in two contexts. One is the United States and the second is the United Kingdom. In both those countries, in the United States primarily, there's been tremendous cultural war, tremendous social polarization, political polarization. Less so in the United Kingdom, but it's there and it's growing. And so things rarely stay in their containers in a connected world. Mm-hmm. So what you've also seen is some of the sort of turning to faith has happened amongst people who lived the secular life script and then became very disillusioned with it. So there's this great collapse of trust in it. Just as we've seen trust in all these Western institutions, you've also seen a collapse in the trust of the sort of progressive movement institution as well. So, part of that is the thing that movement told you not to look at was faith. So there's almost this sort of transgressive, just as there's the whole trad wife thing, it's like it seems traditional, but not to someone who is being wholeheartedly running into the sort of transgressive, progressive life script. Sure. So it's like, you rebel by doing the opposite of what the previous generation did, So all of a sudden these things which to previous generations in the 1950s would have looked totally establishment and mainstream, all of a sudden get a bit of a transgressive air. Peter Gay, in his book on modernism, I think he called it The Lure of Heresy, which he basically, was making the point that modernity or, the modern world is a constant search for the next heresy, and often the heresy is, what was previously out of fashion. We see that in fashion and movies and everything. So in part of that too, there's also a turn to conservative politics. And, if your parents were sort of, centre-left, progressives, sort of baby boomers, the most rebellious thing a kid can do is, maybe become a traditional Catholic, who votes, right and to parties that are, was considered previously beyond the, traditional, like even the acceptable right. So 100%. There is this part of this where people are looking at alternatives and things, the Overton window's moved in what's possible to look at. At the same time, it's moved further left as well, for others. But we're talking about the right here. So the other thing I think that's happening is that part of this rightward turn in the culture, which instinctively feels power draining away from the West, is to try and then reinvigorate the West. And even the West is an interesting term because you're noticing that more and more. It's less, went from a panic about what's happening in my country to a panic in what's happening in the overall Western project, is a sort of kind of, well, one thing we need is a return to faith as well. That nihilism is deadly. And perhaps, I think about, Niall Ferguson wrote a book. It was like the killer applications of the West. And I think one of them was Christianity, I think. So people sort of positing that intellectually, and people like Tom Holland have written about, like a lot of the sort of stuff that actually, underpins a lot of sort of the things that people liked about Western culture or liberal democracy or whatever was actually Christian. So then that sort of flowed into, well, maybe we need more people going to church. So you sort of have characters like Elon Musk, who doesn't go to church as far as we know, isn't necessarily living a Christian lifestyle. I don't know if he would even describe himself as a Christian, still on the platform saying people to go to church. We need to return to Christianity. So you've seen this as sort of partly of what's happened. So you're starting to see, not in all places, but almost because the two things are happening in similar in similar contexts, a little bit of a fusing together, or the two chickens are in the hen house. I don't know if that's a traditional saying. I just made it up.
Sure.
Sounded good.
Sense.
I could
I
have
used
just
to
kept
say it
going.
all the time.
When you're on the farm.
Yep.
So the second thing is, I think a lot of people on the right have seen the energy of religious renewal, and then, as all good political operatives do, how can we sort of use this? Some genuinely are part of those movements themselves. And so, you've seen this interesting, like just in the last little bit, and this is what people are asking me about a lot off air. So I thought I'd bring it on air because sometimes that's the question that you need to talk about, is the mood out there is like, there seems to be a conservative renewal happening, or the potential of a conservative renewal. How much is that aligned to a Christian renewal as well?
Yeah.
Now, I just want to talk about this contextually in particular countries. I think also what has happened as this sort of like falling over of the technocratic, liberal democratic, neoliberal, neoconservative order is in Europe, this sort of turn to, this sort of conflating of the two perhaps is different to what's happening in the United States.
Sure.
So let's talk about Europe first. One thing in Europe is the key social, the social issue at the moment is immigration. Pretty much all the countries that are turning to the right, you could argue it's a reaction against immigration policies. Interesting caveat would be Denmark, where the social sort of Democrats actually have very restrictive immigration policies. And possibly even Australia, in that our Labor Party had followed on from the Conservative Party, our Liberal parties, stopped the boats thing, and Australia basically has no illegal immigration, very little because of quite stringent border controls. So the two countries that have done that, actually you've got quite strong, left-wing parties in power. But behind so much of that is Islam. And, it's interesting, if you look at Richard Dawkins, and the New Atheist, Richard Dawkins really sort of comes to prominence. He was obviously a well-known scientist, wrote The Selfish Gene and so on. But the New Atheist movement really gets some steam after the attacks of September 11th. And instead of just seeing Islam, they see it as overarching all religion as a problem. In 2024 on LBC Radio in an interview, Richard Dawkins said there's a difference between believing Christians and cultural Christians. And he basically said, I'm a cultural Christian. There's something in his heart. He loves the idea of evensong at a village church, and that actually there's a sort of decency about Christianity. What he was really concerned about was the rise of Islam. So in countries where there's countries which see themselves as connected to the land ethnically, and I'm not saying whether the governments do, but there's a sense in the people, they see that even if they become secular, hang on, there is a story here. So as they sort of move out of sort of the liberal democratic thing, looking for a search for meaning, they start looking to that story, and then they see the devotedness of Islam as it's practiced in many of their environments and prayer and so on, and mosques growing up. And there's a sense that that's part of that loss of control story.
Yeah.
So you start to get, and I talked about possibly this happening. One thing, I'll just say this as well. One thing I was sort of saying a few times in a few places, a little bit provocatively in 2019, I'd be in a secular place and I'd say one thing that we could see would be the massive return of cultural Christianity. And people would say, oh, come on, like to say that, in, I don't know, Portland or Seattle or something, seemed ridiculous. But I wonder if it seems less ridiculous now. And so a lot of people in those places, you're seeing this thing of, well, we're not not necessarily going to go down to a local Pentecostal church and stand in the front row and wave our arms around. But the idea of Christianity as part of our identity, and perhaps a return to a sign of cultural Christianity, because we're afraid with demographic trends that we're losing control to Islam. And obviously terrorism, there's all these sort of things around that as part of that story. So I think in Europe, you're seeing very much the sort of temptation because of this sort of pan-Europe, translocal entity of the European Union. How does that protect local identities? So the idea of flags, in the United Kingdom, this whole sort of after the march against immigration, flags, and do churches put up flags and so on? And is this conflated with this sort of Christian thing? So that's part of that. I think in the United States, it's different. Issues of immigration are obviously massive. But I think there's also something going else on where in Europe, and I'd say it's the same in Australia and New Zealand and Canada and other parts of the sort of West outside the US, is we'd sort of understood that we'd lost cultural power.
Yeah.
Like I never grew up in Australia thinking the church had some huge cultural power lever it could just pull. It would talk about gambling, or it would sort of be a moral conscience at some points, but even that's become less and less, in the last sort of while. But I think in the US, there still was in lots of places a fundamental sense that this was a Christian country, that the church, has a cultural power. And as secularism happened in the US, and, I think probably in the sort of 2010s as some of the research around nuns came in, no religious growth, the deconstruction movement, all this sort of stuff happened. And then particularly in 2020, and maybe even the decision on gay marriage, and then in 2020, a lot of the protest movements, I think there was almost a kind of sheer panic, which was different to how secularism was experienced in the rest of the West. There was an assumption that there was still power there. And so, there is a sense that a renewal project, yes, it's people praying, yes, it's people in churches, yes, it's ministries growing, yes, it's these things, but also perhaps it's also a taking back of a power that was only recently lost. It's interesting in the US, you hear a lot about this sort of theory. I've forgotten the guy's name, but it talks about, America was in this like positive world where people were positive towards Christianity, and then it was sort of just neutral, and now it's negative, and now they're in the negative world, and they're sort of like up against the wall, and to me it's a really confusing thing because, I'm reading a biography of Jade Hoover at the moment, which I think won the Pulitzer Prize for biography last year. And, she makes the point I've forgotten the author's name, but she makes the point that Jade Hoover, who was a Presbyterian, and despite some of the things going in his private life, which we know about now, at the time was sort of open about his faith and would speak at Christian things and so on. That was really unusual and weird, and newspapers commented on that in 1947. So this idea that there was this sort of positive era, people can pull these little things, but, any country. So, you look at, say, apartheid South Africa was that positive world for the church in apartheid South Africa? Well, for some, you had a very Christian society, you had the church speaking into social policy, but it was apartheid, and did that reflect a Christian value? So I think these things are far more murkier and far more complex than these sort of very simple schema put out. And, there is some truth that has become more, there is some elements of truth in these schemas, but for me, they fall short in that they don't deal with the complexity of the reality. Mm-hmm. So all that to say, I think one of the temptations in the US is that a project of national renewal or a reassertion of American power, also in a time where now America is in a kind of Cold War, but I don't know if Cold War is the right term, a kind of hyperpower competition with China, can get conflated with revival and renewal. Mm-hmm. And the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the nation get mixed. And I think this is what a lot of people are expressing. And people get into the weeds and, you've seen a lot of people since the Charlie Kirk thing express this, and people get into the weeds, this person said that and this happened there and so on. But I think at the essence, when you go to the 30,000-foot view is, when does the kingdom of God bring under judgment the nations of the world? And history is replete with times when it gets really bad, when the kingdoms of the world are seen as absolutely flush with the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. And so, and maybe it's because we're Australians and maybe we have a much more cynical view of politics, and perhaps because the origins of our nation were terra nullius, a sort of wiping away of what was a clear Indigenous culture that was there for millennia, and then a penal colony and all these things, that there's a little bit of a sort of cynicism that we have. It's more like the lucky country, wow, we've managed to pull this thing off, despite everything, So there's I guess what I'm trying to say, there's a less utopian view we have of our own nation. But definitely in the US, there's still that utopian view. So I think you can see the conflating of these things. Now, having said that about Australia, at the March for Immigration, or the March for whatever it was on the weekend in Melbourne, you had the flags and there was a lot of people who were playing Oz rock hits from the 70s all the way up to the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you could argue that what those people are pining for is, again, that 90s view of Australia, as sort of peak Australia in their minds. But also, there were Orthodox crosses and there was Christian symbols, just as you saw in the March in Immigration in Britain. And sort of these questions around, what is a Christian, a project starts to emerge in the midst of it, which is a political project always. Now, look, I'm a person who I think politics exists in everything. Polis is ultimately, going back to Aristotle or whatever, it's the what's happening in a city in a group of people. But I think the danger is thus. There's multiple dangers. We could do a whole political theology thing here. I'm not going to do that, right? Because we're already been going for some time. But I will say this. Structurally, I just don't see this rightward turn pulling off what it's trying to achieve. John Gray, I've quoted him before, and he said this quote in, I think it was the New Statesman. No, I think he said it on Unheard in an interview with Freddie Sayers, one of the only other Sayers. There's not common name Sayers, so when you hear Sayers, your ears prick up. Freddie Sayers interviewed John Gray in Unheard, and John Gray made this point. This was when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. He said, the crisis is not going to come when Boris Johnson is Prime Minister. It's going to come when Labor get into power and people realise they've made this change and Labor can't change anything because the structural problems are too big. Mm-hmm. I'm going to extend that out. I think the real crisis hits when Trump is well into his term. Maybe the AfD become more powerful and maybe they have an alliance with the CDU in Germany, or Marine Le Pen comes to power in France, and Nigel Farage comes to power in England, and we could do that throughout the world. Javier Milei is in a crisis in Argentina at the moment and may need a bailout by the US, which is quite extraordinary. The crisis will come when people who have been frustrated and rolled the crazy dice for their future multiple times and realize rolling the dice is not changing anything. That's when the real crisis comes. The structural stuff in the world, the geopolitical conflict, the significant resources conflict, the significant environmental challenge, the significant difficulty and disruptive nature of the internet and artificial intelligence to come, the significant challenges of a world of increased nuclear proliferation, the increased thing of the ability of everything from, it's been called dark networks, the coming together of terrorist groups, organized crime and political radicals is a disruptive force. Like you just look at what's happening in Scandinavia with crime gangs who have been connected to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard affecting something in Australia. The disruptive force of that, the disruptive force of the potential of global conflicts, of the international drug trade in synthetic drugs, the whole gamut of things that were in cyberpunk novels in the early 90s, the deficit issues. These structural changes, the political answers for these, we don't know yet. And so I see any sort of welding together of, a sort of Christian project of renewal that doesn't have a significant cynicism about any political project to bring off the kingdom of God on earth, it's always going to fall short. Because at the end of the day, the kingdom of God on earth does not come in fullness till Jesus comes again and the New Jerusalem comes. That is an act of God, a sovereign act of God. There is two parts to renewal. Part one is the kind of sporadic moves of God where God just like for some reason known to the mind of God pours out his spirit on a particular place and the churches have advanced and it's beautiful, but the ultimate renewing of the heavens and earth is when the kingdom of God comes in its fullness and no political project is going to make that happen. And so all will fall short, and human corruption will come. It could be the corruption of racism. It could be the corruption of economic corruption. It could be just selfishness that you and I could be on the same page and just at the end of the day, I want to compete with you because humans do that. And so I cut off your political thing. It's for all have fallen short and broke, so all have fallen short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. That is going to infect whatever political project we have. Yeah. So I 100% believe in renewal, and I realize that it's something I've been talking about for some time. And I realized the messaging early on in the 2010s was, hey, guys, dare to believe that in this secular culture where people seem to be walking away from the church and there's this seductive consumerist vision before you, that what if God wanted to actually do a renewal in a place like this? People can now see that that's happening. They see, maybe it's not happening on a scale, but they can see some evidences of that around the place, right? So that's less up for debate now. What I'm more concerned about, so keep going. Let's keep praying. Let's keep hoping. Let's just daring to believe. But also what we're going to need now going forward is strong discernment. Strong discernment. And I believe in the prophetic gifts or the gifts of the Spirit. Discernment we need. And we need discernment because it's going to get real murky from here on in. And I just have a sense that a lot of people listen to us because they understand the murkiness and the complexity of things. So I guess I'm just trying to speak to our people out there who perhaps are looking at stuff going, oh, that's great, but yeah. Making these sounds as you're watching your Instagram feed. But I think that we just need a cynicism, a holy cynicism, skepticism about any human project that tries to offer a sort of cosmic totality that it can solve all the problems because it's going to fall short. I know if I was made Prime Minister of Australia, I would stuff it up somehow. And that's not to say people shouldn't go for this in politics. Like, please, anyone who listening to this is involved in politics, and we know a number of you are, my prayers are with you, but go humbly with a hermeneutic of suspicion, not over your, we have them often over the wrong theological things. Have it over your own motivations and come before the Lord and your own political projects. And this is not also advocating a sort of standing above everything at an ivory tower and looking down as the sort of cool, cigar smoking critic. This is actually, we need people engaged in the messiness of this, but understand it's going to be messy. And so I just think we need cynicism or a skepticism that is tempered by an eyes on Jesus, and a skepticism of the left, of the centre, of the right, of whatever on earth may come up, of the techno-utopians, of the Luddites, of all of this. And the conflation between certain political projects. There is political outplays, I think, of renewal, 100%. As I've spoken before, my love for Wesley and the Great Awakening and what happened, and you see it flowing into abolitionism and even concern over the structure of our cities, how they're built in Australia to not have the Dickensian decay that people saw in the UK. I love the outflow of that stuff, but it needs to be done with discernment and wisdom. And I don't have all the answers for what's happening at the moment, but my big prayer at the moment is, now that there seems to be renewal movement, is God, keep it pure.
Come on.
It's good, Mark. Thank you. Anything else to add from anyone before we finish up?
Well, I just think now that the audience can see just Daniel's facial expressions, it's going to add a whole new dimension to this.
Yeah, one can dream. No, that's good, Mark. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your wisdom.
Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you so much for joining with us, and we look forward to chatting with you soon.